A Shaolin monk delivered a swift, precise kick to the face of a U.S. honor guard, sending the ceremonial cap spinning across the marble courtyard. But when that silent sentinel suddenly came to life, all the discipline and pride of the monk's legendary training couldn't save him from what followed. The crowd watched in breathless silence as centuries of martial tradition crashed headlong into the unshakable reality of battlefield-tested military strength. Welcome to the Honor Guard, where every story salutes courage, sacrifice, and honor. Before we continue, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from today? If you believe in honoring those who served, hit that subscribe button to stand with us. And remember, tomorrow will bring you another powerful story to keep the flame of respect alive. The midday sun glinted off the polished stones of Arlington National Cemetery, casting long, solemn shadows across the rows of white headstones. The air carried a hush, as if even the breeze understood the sacredness of the place. Visitors moved quietly, voices low as they approached the tomb of the unknown soldier, a place where the weight of sacrifice could be felt as much as seen. Among the gathered crowd stood Li Wei, a man whose presence seemed at odds with the somber atmosphere. At 35, Li Wei was a striking figure, lean, lithe, with the chiseled frame of someone who had dedicated his life to discipline and training. His saffron-colored Shaolin robes, though modernized with subtle embroidery, drew curious glances. Tourists nudged one another, whispering about the famous martial artist they recognized from television specials and viral videos. Li Wei's face carried a serenity that came from years of practice, but beneath the surface simmered a confidence that some might call arrogance. 3 times an international champion and full-contact martial arts competitions owner of 2 high-end dojos in Los Angeles and Hong Kong, Li Wei saw himself as the living embodiment of Shaolin superiority. He folded his arms as he watched the U.S. Honor Guard at their post. The soldier ramrod's straight eyes-forward expression, carved from stone, moved with the precision of a machine. His every step, turn, and rifle maneuver executed flawlessly. But to Li Wei's eyes, it was all empty movement, ritual, pageantry. Beside him, one of his traveling students, a younger monk with eager eyes, leaned closer. "Master, they stand so still. Is this meant to inspire fear in enemies?" he asked quietly in Mandarin. Li Wei's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "No, my young friend. This is theater. They stand as statues while real warriors move, adapt, conquer." His gaze hardened. They confused stillness with strength. The murmuring of the crowd was punctuated by the rhythmic click of the honor guard's boots as he completed another pass. The silence that followed each turn, each ceremonial shift, seemed to demand respect. But in Li Wei, it stirred a different reaction. "This, my brothers," Li Wei spoke now in English, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear, "is the difference between form and substance. We have come from Shaolin to see the world's warriors. But here we find actors in uniform." A few heads turned, some tourists frowning at the comment, others too polite or too uncertain to respond. Li Wei's student hesitated. "Master, perhaps this is not the place." Li Wei waved a dismissive hand. "A warrior should challenge what he sees. That is the way of truth." His dark eyes fixed on the honor guard. "If they believe in their strength, let them prove it." Across the way, watching the scene unfold, stood Colonel Tom Henderson, retired Marine, a man who had traded his service uniform for a simple jacket adorned with a small lapel pin, an eagle globe, and anchor that spoke volumes without saying a word. Henderson's years in Iraq and Afghanistan had taught him to spot trouble before it broke the surface, and now his gut told him that something was coming. He shifted his stance, moving closer through the crowd, eyes locked on Li Wei. Li Wei took a deliberate step forward, drawing the attention of the honor guard with nothing more than his proximity. But the soldier didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. His gaze remained fixed ahead, his discipline unbroken. "To stand still," Li Wei said, addressing those within earshot, "is to invite defeat. A true warrior flows like water, strikes like lightning. The student at his side tugged at his sleeve, nervous now. Master, Liwei held up a hand. Watch. Observe how empty form collapses before true combat art. The stage was set. The honor guard remained unmoved as if carved from the marble beneath his feet. But Liwei was preparing to show the world the folly of confusing ceremony with power. The heat of the midday sun was nothing compared to the heat rising within Liwei. He could feel it in his chest, a mixture of righteous confidence and the thrill of an audience. The murmurs around him fed his energy. Some visitors had begun recording, their phones discreetly raised, sensing that something unscripted was about to unfold. Liwei took another step forward, his sandals silent on the stone. His posture was relaxed, but there was a coiled power beneath the surface, like a tiger surveying prey. The honor guard, unfazed, continued his precise pacing along the black mat. Each step measured, each movement a lesson in discipline. Liwei smirked. To him it was all an act. An impressive one perhaps, but still an act. This is what passes for military strength in America, he said loudly enough for the growing crowd. His English was fluent with the faintest trace of an accent that lent his words an edge of sharpness. A man in uniform pretending at war, moving like a clock wound too tight. A young couple exchanged uneasy glances. An elderly man in a Vietnam veteran ball cap shook his head slowly, but said nothing. Liwei's student, still at his side, whispered urgently, Master, please, this is sacred ground. We should not. We honor warriors by testing them. Liwei cut him off, his tone firm but not harsh. If he is truly strong, let him show it. If he is only ceremony, then better he learns now before real danger comes. Liwei's eyes swept the crowd, ensuring he had their attention. And he did. The rhythm of the honor guard's movement continued behind him, the measured turn, the shouldering of the rifle, the silent command to honor the fallen. But Liwei was no longer watching the ritual. His focus had shifted entirely to the man performing it. Observe, he said to the tourists around him, gesturing with one hand, the sleeve of his robe falling back to reveal the corded strength of his forearm. The difference between living art and empty ritual. He dropped into a low stance, balanced, fluid, lethal. His feet seemed to melt into the stone. His hands moved slowly at first, then with blinding speed, as he demonstrated a sequence of Shaolin strikes. The motions were graceful, but carried the unmistakable weight of years of training. A few in the crowd couldn't help but applaud the display. Liwei straightened, breathing steady. Thank you, he said with a slight bow. But remember, what I show is not for show. It is for survival, for victory. And then, with the casualness of a man certain of his superiority, he began to shadow the honor guard's path, mimicking the soldier's movements with exaggerated precision. Where the guard turned with discipline, Liwei turned with flourish. Where the guard stepped with solemn purpose, Liwei stepped with showman's flair. It was no longer demonstration, it was mockery. Across the courtyard, Colonel Tom Henderson moved deliberately closer, weaving through the gathering crowd. His weathered face was set in a line of quiet disapproval, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. He knew the posture of a man spoiling for a confrontation, and Liwei wore it like a second skin. Liwei's voice rose, carrying above the respectful hush that had reigned before. Is this all that remains of the great warriors of this land? A man who walks back and forth, eyes empty, spirit caged by rules. The honor guard remained silent, unmoving, except for his prescribed steps. His jaw was set, his gaze fixed beyond the horizon. Liwei's smirk deepened. You see, not even the dignity to acknowledge a challenge. A small ripple of discomfort spread through the crowd. The reverence of the setting was being pierced, and it set nerves on edge. A mother quietly took her child's hand and began to guide them away. A man in a wheelchair adjusted his cap, the silver of his Air Force pin catching the sun. Liwei wasn't done. His need to prove his point burned too brightly. With deliberate confidence, he positioned himself at the edge of the guard's path, forcing the soldier to march within inches of him. Each pass, Li Wei would mirror the movements, his eyes never leaving the guard's face. Henderson had seen enough. He stepped forward, voice low but firm. "Son, I suggest you stand down. This isn't a stage. That man's doing a job, and it's one you don't understand." Li Wei didn't look at him. His gaze remained locked on the honor guard. "And yet I will teach him something today." Henderson's jaw tightened, but he held his ground, waiting, hoping reason might prevail. But Li Wei had already decided. This was more than display. This was his moment to prove Shaolin's superiority over what he saw as empty tradition. The sun beat down on the courtyard, but a different kind of heat filled the space now, a charged tension that seemed to pull the air tight. The crowd larger now stood in uneasy silence. Phones recorded not with excitement, but with a growing sense that they were witnesses to something wrong, something that didn't belong on this hallowed ground. Li Wei took a slow breath, drawing in the moment. His senses sharpened, heart steady, mind clear. In his world, this was combat, even if his opponent refused to acknowledge it. The honor guard's silence only fueled his need to expose what he saw as a fraud in uniform. He moved deliberately into the guard's path, stepping closer than before. So close that the polished toe of the guard's boot nearly brushed the hem of Li Wei's robe. The soldier's face betrayed nothing. His training held firm. His gaze remained locked straight ahead, as if the world beyond the tomb was all that mattered. Li Wei began to circle him, slow at first, then faster, his movements flowing like water around stone. His hands flashed out, never touching, but close enough that the guard must have felt the air shift. Quick strikes stopped inches from the soldier's chest, his head, his shoulders. A show of precision, of control. Or so Li Wei believed. To stand so still, Li Wei announced, voice loud, clear, cutting through the respectful quiet, is to surrender your life to any man willing to take it. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Discomfort deepened. An elderly woman clutched the cross around her neck. A father gathered his children close, whispering that they should move along. But they stayed as if hoping this would end, before lines were crossed that could not be uncrossed. Colonel Henderson had closed the distance now, his voice low, measured, but edged with steel. "That's enough, son. Back away. You're making a mistake you can't take back." Li Wei didn't look at him. His focus was absolute. He raised his voice, addressing the crowd like a teacher in a temple courtyard. "Watch carefully. What good is tradition if it leaves you blind to threat? This man is bound by rules. I am bound only by truth." His hands moved again, demonstrating the fluid strikes of his style, stopping just shy of the guard's face, each time a little closer than the last. The honor guard kept his bearing. His face was carved from the same stone as the tomb he protected. No flinch, no break in composure. Li Wei's smile deepened. "Fear keeps him still," he said, voice dripping with certainty, not strength. The crowd was no longer simply watching. They were holding their breath. A few voices murmured, pleading for him to stop. But Li Wei was too far gone, consumed by his own narrative. Then came the moment that would change everything. Li Wei shifted his stance, weight balanced perfectly, body coiled for speed. His foot came up in a blur, a spinning heel kick delivered with the power and precision that had brought him victory in arenas across the world. The kick connected with a sharp crack, the sound of impact echoing across the stone. The honor guard's ceremonial cap flew from his head, spinning through the air, before landing with a soft thud at the base of a marble column. The crowd gasped, some recoiling, others frozen, unable to believe what they'd just seen. Li Wei lowered his leg, breathing controlled, confident. But something felt off. The guard hadn't fallen, hadn't staggered. His head had turned with the force of the kick, but his body had remained rooted, unshaken. Slowly, impossibly, the guard's head turned back. His eyes for the first time locked onto Li Wei's. No fear, no anger, only clarity. The clarity of a man who had seen real combat, faced real death, and survived. Colonel Henderson exhaled the sound barely audible over the stunned silence. His voice dropped to a whisper meant only for himself. "Now you've done it." For the space of a heartbeat, time itself seemed to hold its breath. The crowd stood in a stunned silence, as if even the wind dared not disturb the moment. The ceremonial cap resting now against cold marble was the only sign that anything had happened at all. Leeway felt a flicker of doubt, the first crack in his confidence. His kick had been perfect, clean, fast, powerful. He had felled grown men in competition with less. But here the man before him stood steady, unbroken eyes fixed on him now, with a focus that sent a shiver through Leeway's spine. The honor guard slowly, deliberately removed his gloves, setting them down beside his fallen cap, with the care of a man placing a folded flag into the hands of a grieving widow. He bent at the waist, picked up his cap, brushed the dust from it, and set it aside. Then for the first time he stepped off the prescribed path. The guard's name was Staff Sergeant David Miller, a ranger before his ceremonial post. 4 tours, 2 Bronze Stars, 1 Purple Heart, and more silent nights of danger than he'd ever bother counting. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His body did the talking. With a step as smooth as it was sudden, he closed the distance between himself and Leeway. The movement wasn't showy, wasn't dramatic. It was the efficient, economical shift of a man trained to end fights before they began. Leeway's instincts, honed by years of training, snapped into action. His hands rose, his body angled, ready to meet the challenge. For the first time in the encounter, there was no trace of mockery in his eyes, only readiness. Now we see Truth Leeway breathe more to himself than anyone else. But truth came at him faster than he could process. Miller's first move was simple, textbook even. A palm strike not designed to hurt, but to disrupt, to break Leeway's balance. The monk blocked, but the force behind it was unexpected, sending him sliding a half step back. Before Leeway could recover, Miller was inside his guard, his arms a blur of practiced motion, redirecting, controlling, neutralizing. Leeway countered on instinct, a sharp elbow toward the side of Miller's head, a move that had ended bouts before they'd even begun. But Miller's head slipped under it, his hands locking onto Leeway's arm in a grip like steel, turning the energy of the strike against its master. With one decisive motion, Miller swept Leeway's leg out from under him. The monk hit the stone hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs, his breath leaving in a surprised grunt. Before he could move, before he could think, Miller was there, one knee on his chest, one hand pinning his wrist, the other ready but unnecessary. Leeway froze, not out of fear, but out of recognition. The fight was over, and it had never truly begun. The crowd stood in hushed awe, witnessing the swift, clinical end to what had moments ago seemed like a show of dominance. Colonel Henderson approached, his voice steady. "Let him up, Sergeant. I think he understands now." Miller didn't speak. He rose in one fluid motion, offering no more aggression than necessary. His face was composed, his breathing steady, as if the entire exchange had cost him nothing. Leeway lay still for a moment, staring up at the sky as if trying to find an answer there. Slowly he sat up, rubbing his ribs, feeling the ache of humility more than pain. What had begun as arrogance had ended as education. Leeway stayed seated on the coal stone for a moment longer, his breath returning in slow, measured draws. The world around him had shifted. A moment ago, he had been the master, the teacher, the man demonstrating superiority. Now he was the student, and the lesson had been delivered in silence with precision that spoke louder than any words. Miller stood over him, not in triumph, not in gloating, but in duty. His stance was relaxed but ready, the posture of someone who had nothing to prove, but everything to protect. Leeway looked up at him, and for the first time that day there was no arrogance in his gaze, only clarity, only the humbled recognition of a man who had misjudged what he could not understand. Colonel Henderson approached, stepping between them, his voice carrying the weight of decades in uniform. That's what real combat looks like, son. No flash, no audience. Just a mission and a man ready to do what's needed. The crowd, silent and respectful, watched as Henderson knelt slightly, offering Li Wei a hand. After a moment's hesitation, Li Wei took it, allowing the retired colonel to help him to his feet. Henderson kept his grip firm. "You're lucky," he said quietly. "Lucky it was Sergeant Miller you decided to test. Some of the boys wouldn't have stopped with a pin and a sweep." Li Wei straightened, brushing the dust from his robe, and inclined his head. "I see that now. I was blind." Miller retrieved his gloves, replacing them with the same care he'd shown, removing them. He picked up his cap, placed it on his head, and with a precision born of thousands of hours of training, came back to attention. No trace of the brief skirmish showed in his bearing. He was once more the silent sentinel, the guardian of the fallen. Li Wei turned to the crowd, his voice lower now, absent the bravado from before. "I owe you all an apology, and to this man," he gestured to Miller, "my deepest respect. I mistook his stillness for weakness. I was wrong." A ripple moved through the onlookers, a quiet murmur of approval, of forgiveness perhaps. The cameras that had once sought to capture spectacle now recorded something more rare, the moment a proud man owned his mistake. Colonel Henderson folded his arms across his chest, watching Li Wei with eyes that had seen men broken and rebuilt by combat and by truth. "You know who you tangled with?" Henderson asked, his voice gentle, almost conversational now. "Staff Sergeant David Miller. 4 tours, Afghanistan, Iraq. Bronze Stars for valor, Purple Heart for saving his squad after an ambush in Helmand. He stood guard here because he's earned the right." Li Wei blinked, absorbing the weight of Henderson's words. I thought he was only ceremony." Henderson's laugh was quiet, without malice. "Ceremony, son. That man's ceremony is built on a foundation of blood, sweat, and sacrifice you clearly didn't recognize." The weight of what Li Wei had done settled on him fully. He bowed deeply, not as a performer, but as a man offering respect the only way he knew how. Miller, expression unchanged, gave the smallest of nods. Enough to acknowledge. Enough to accept. From the edge of the crowd, the Arlington security team approached at last, radios crackling, eyes assessing. Their leader, a tall, broad-shouldered lieutenant, stopped beside Henderson. "Colonel, Sergeant, we've got it from here." Henderson nodded. He's learned his lesson, but I suspect there's protocol to follow. The lieutenant gave a small, understanding smile. "There always is." Li Wei stood quietly as the security team explained the next steps. There would be questions, there would be reports, there might be charges, but more than any of that, there was the knowledge that he had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed and been brought back, not with violence but with honor. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, murmuring to one another about what they'd witnessed, one truth remained clear in every mind. The strength of the honor guard wasn't in the rifle or the uniform or the march. It was in the discipline, in the silent promise to stand between the fallen and any who might dishonor them. And today that promise had been kept. The courtyard gradually returned to its familiar quiet, but the air still felt heavy with what had just occurred. The tourists who lingered spoke in hushed tones, as if the walls of Arlington itself were listening, weighing their words. The gravity of the ground beneath their feet had been made real in a way no tour guide could have explained. Li Wei stood beside the security team, his head lowered, his heart pounding not from exertion, but from the weight of his own realization. The arrogance that had brought him to this moment now burned away, leaving behind something cleaner, something closer to truth. Colonel Henderson stood at his side, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the tomb. "It's not about you, son," he said quietly. "It never was. Not here." Li Wei turned to him, his voice low. "I see that now. I came to test him, to test myself, and I failed." Henderson shook his head. "No, You failed the moment you thought these men were about proving anything. The honor guard isn't here to win fights. They're here to remind us of the cost of freedom. The words hit harder than any strike could have. Li Wei drew in a slow breath, letting it settle. He turned to Miller, who had resumed his post, the picture of duty, his rifle at rest. His gaze fixed his mind. Li Wei now understood, sharper than steel. "May I speak with him?" Li Wei asked the security lieutenant, his tone stripped of any trace of command or expectation. The officer exchanged a look with Henderson, then nodded. "You've got a minute. Make it count." Li Wei approached carefully, stopping a respectful distance away. "Staff Sergeant Miller," he said, his voice soft. "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you my thanks. You could have crushed me. Instead, you taught me, and you did it with honor." Miller didn't move. His eyes didn't shift. His discipline held. But after a long moment, he spoke, his voice quiet enough only Li Wei could hear. "Stillness isn't weakness. Remember that." Li Wei bowed deeply. "I will." Stepping back, he joined Henderson and the security team. The lieutenant motioned him toward a side path where paperwork and formalities would follow. Li Wei didn't protest. He had come seeking a demonstration of strength, and he had found it, just not as he expected. As they walked, Henderson kept pace beside him. "You've learned today what takes some men a lifetime to understand. There's a difference between fighting for a crowd and fighting for something bigger than yourself." Li Wei nodded. "I thought my art was about honor, but I see now. I had made it about ego." Henderson gave a small smile, one of a teacher seeing his student finally grasp the lesson. "You're not the first. You won't be the last. But you've got a choice what you do with that knowledge now." The paperwork was completed with quiet efficiency. The decision was made not to press formal charges, recognizing that the greatest consequence had already been delivered in the humbling Li Wei had received. The security team reminded him of the sanctity of Arlington and its guards, and of the laws that protected them. Li Wei accepted it all with humility. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped lower, casting long golden beams across the cemetery, Li Wei stood silently at the edge of a small gathering for a wreath-laying ceremony. He didn't draw attention to himself. He didn't speak. He simply watched as the honor guard performed their duty, his heart full of respect he hadn't known he was capable of. When the final salute was given and the mourners began to leave, Colonel Henderson clapped a hand on Li Wei's shoulder. "Maybe next time, son, you'll recognize the quiet strength before you have to be shown it." Li Wei gave a small, genuine smile. "Next time, Colonel, I will." And for the first time that day, the peace of Arlington seemed to settle over him, as if the land itself had accepted his unspoken apology. The following morning, the air at Arlington was crisp, the kind of clean cold that carried with it the scent of dew and stone. Li Wei returned alone, no longer the man who had arrived with confidence carved in granite. His steps were quieter now, his eyes no longer searching for a challenge, but instead seeking understanding. He stood at the edge of the courtyard, watching as the honor guard took their post movement's precise rifle balance with the same reverence as a priest handling sacred scripture. Tourists gathered, but this time there was no murmur of tension, no sense of confrontation, only respect. Li Wei remained still, as if trying to absorb the discipline he had once mocked. His gaze softened, not with weakness, but with a new strength, one born of humility. Colonel Henderson appeared beside him as if summoned by the quiet. The older man's hands rested behind his back, his face thoughtful. For a moment they said nothing. They simply watched. "You came back," Henderson finally said, his voice carrying no judgment, only observation. "I had to," Li Wei replied, his tone steady. "I thought strength came from action, from motion. But I was wrong. I needed to see what it means to stand for something greater than yourself." Henderson nodded slowly, his eyes on the honor guard. "That's the lesson most men miss. Strength isn't always in the strike. Sometimes it's in the stillness, in standing your ground no matter what storms come." Li Wei turned to him, sincerity clear in his expression. "I owe that man a debt I can never repay." You repaid it today, Henderson said, nodding toward the tomb. By understanding what this place means, what those men represent, the ones standing and the ones they guard. Together they stood in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the soft cadence of boots on stone and the whisper of the flag in the morning breeze. Lewy drew a deep breath. When I kicked him, it was to prove a point. But what I saw in his eyes wasn't fear or anger. It was resolve. I have fought many men, but never one like him. Henderson smiled faintly. That's because you weren't fighting a man. You were fighting everything he stands for. And that fight, you'll never win it. None of us can. We can only choose to honor it. As the ceremony concluded, the crowd dispersed quietly, their respect deepened by what they'd witnessed, not just the ritual, but the invisible strength that powered it. Lewy remained watching the guard until the last tourist had left. Only then did he bow a gesture of genuine reverence before turning to go. His lesson had been learned not through words, not through trophies, but through a single moment of truth. Sometimes the most powerful demonstrations of strength come not from action, but from restraint. What would you have seen that day? Would you have recognized the true strength behind the stillness? Let us know in the comments below. If this story touched you, give us a like and subscribe for more stories that reveal the hidden truths behind traditions we too often take for granted. We'll see you next time.